good to be here. Can you hear me okay at the back? Give me a wave. Cool? Good. Wow, it goes right up into it starts to get a bit hazy. There's clouds at the top there, disappearing into the mist. But if I stand on here, I can't actually see your eyes. So whoever designed the raised seating here didn't realize there's going to be a big RSJ across the front. Anyway, so I'd like to share some insights and some learning that I've had over the last, over the last 5 years about software delivery and how tangled that can get, and how if we use some ideas from things like Team Topologies combined with some flow metrics and some decoupling techniques, and also think about how we're sharing knowledge, then we can have some success in this space. The short version is that if you're feeling a bit tired, a bit sleepy, the short version is this. So you can look at this and then maybe go to sleep a little bit if you fancy it. So basically, we need to use balanced health metrics, plus some Team Topologies techniques, to help find good boundaries for fast flow by untangling or decoupling separate services. If you can put that in your brain, now you can have a little snooze if you like, and then we'll come back later on. It's actually two separate dimensions we need to think about. It's decoupling of teams and technology to achieve fast flow of value, but that itself is not enough. What we've heard Tom already talk about is about the need for sharing knowledge across, well, it's now multiple different organizations in the Flutter group, and in this case through a community of practice focused on agility. So we've decoupled for fast flow, but we need to kind of diffuse awareness and learning actively across all these different teams and areas of the organization. Because otherwise we end up with kind of local optimization. We end up with a lot of misalignment in terms of mission, incentives, and a bunch of other things. So I'm the co-author of the book Team Topologies. I actually have 2 copies here, which are brand crispy new. And so I don't know how we're going to do it, Roy, but we need to do some kind of little competition-y thing, and then you can get two lucky people can have a copy later. And I'm also the originator of something called Adapt Together, which I'll explain a little bit later on. You'll find me online at matthewskelton.com. I'm running 2 companies. One is called Conflux and one is called Team Topologies. Don't be in a situation if you're an entrepreneur where you're running 2 companies. Try and arrange it so you're running 1. It's much harder, but there are reasons which are too boring to go into. This book here, Team Topologies, it was published almost 5 years ago now. It's been 5 years since September 2019. It's published by IT Revolution Press, which is arguably probably the world's kind of best curated collection of really, really good kind of IT and business kind of advice and books and so on and so on. Gene Kim is the founder, and he and his amazing team runs the events that used to be called DevOps Enterprise Summit. Now it's called Enterprise IT something. But anyway, it's amazing. Bringing together some of the most amazing kind of stories about large-scale agile IT, enterprise IT success stories. Almost anything in the IT Revolution Press book catalog is worth a read, and they're carefully selected to go really well together, complement each other. We're very pleased that the book has won some awards, things like I think it was in the top 10 of best product management books of all time a couple of years ago. I'm not a product manager, but it was nice to see that we're able to speak to that kind of personal or that kind of persona. What are the kind of things that we do? What are the kind of things that Team Topologies encourages? There's a few things. The first one really is that we need to continuously untangle business concepts. It sounds a bit strange, but the way I see software now is software is really just an encoding of a business intent. we've got a business intent, we've got an intention to do something, we're going to encode that in software, and then that's what it is. If the intent is all tangled up, if we've got different concepts that are kind of blended together or not sufficiently well separated, the software itself is going to be tangled. And we're going to find it very, very difficult to get a good flow. So this is who considers himself to be like a domain-driven design practitioner or aware of domain-driven design, DDD, at least a few. So obviously this untangling is really what domain-driven design is there to deal with, because we're thinking about the meaning of words, and we're looking for words, we're looking for situations in the organization where words have got a similar meaning or a different meaning, and so on, or where the nature of the word changes from one part of the user journey to another, and so on, using that sense of meaning to help us actually architect and design software systems better. So that, but the challenge is you won't find this, you won't, in the Agile Manifesto, for example, or any of these kind of other places, you won't find a very strong driver to keep our concepts untangled. So it's not a particularly familiar thing to lots of organizations to be doing. The organizations are moving very, very quickly, are doing this anyway. They might not call it that, but they are doing something like that. They're looking for situations where the word order, like an order ID, like I've placed an order, where the word order means something different here compared to over here. And they're being very careful to keep those two meanings apart. But there's also a strong tendency in lots of organizations to say, hey, we've got a database with an order field, let's just drop everything in there, we'll be all right. Without trying to work out whether those two concepts are the same or different. Team Topologies encourages us to find and adjust team and system boundaries for fast flow. So in the past, we might have kind of done some negotiation about where responsibility boundaries sit for various reasons. Now, the primary reason that we need to think about adjusting boundaries is for fast flow. We need to minimize handoffs. We've known this for ages. This is what kind of the DevOps movement came up with. What was that? Starting in about 2008. How can we minimize the handoffs from one team to another? And yet, it's still amazing how many organizations have not taken that to heart and still have, oh, well, one team can do this thing, and then they'll finish their work, and another team will pick it up and do a bit more on it, and then they'll pass it to another. And that's the recipe for keeping things as slow as possible. Dependencies are good. Dependencies are good if they're a certain kind of dependency. There's a lot of people talk about, oh, we need to get rid of all dependencies in software. But it's not true. Dependencies are brilliant. This laptop here depends on a nice, probably like an M whatever processor inside it, a lot of silicon, an operating system made by Apple, a bunch of other things. I want those dependencies. They're great because they're not blocking. I don't have to wait on that thing before I can do some useful work on my laptop. If I put a Jira ticket into Apple every time I wanted to create and send a new email, oh, can you do something so I can send a new email, please, Apple? It would make absolutely no sense. So the kind of dependencies we need to avoid are blocking dependencies, dependencies that block us from doing something in the moment. And separating out blocking from kind of non-blocking dependencies, I guess, or dependencies that just allow flow is a kind of crucial concept to get our heads around. Some decision making needs to move to teams, obviously. We've known that for decades and decades, but still it's worth emphasizing that on an ongoing basis. Based on what I've seen in the last 5 years since the book was published, Team Topologies it exposes any lack of clarity in purpose and conflict in priorities and misalignment of incentives. Team Topologies is not the only thing that does that. Any kind of properly, any approach which is like flow-centric and which is trying to introduce agility and so on, will do the same thing, because Team Topologies is just one of several approaches which is emphasizing flow and true agility and that kind of thing. But what these things all do is bring all that stuff to the surface. All that awkward stuff about the organization that the organization really needs to actually deal with comes to the surface when we're working in this kind of way. The ideas have been used by all kind of different organizations. So we've got case studies from Docker technology company, case study from Flow, the health company, there's an interesting example from NHS Digital. Some of you may have worked even on that in the vaccine booking service. Did anyone work on that here? That was like a Leeds-based thing in the middle of the pandemic. That was really cool. There were physicians who were involved in kind of vaccine rollout, who were using Team Topologies language and principles to work with software engineers in order to build the vaccine rollout, vaccine booking service. But they were using some of the Team Topologies like concepts. Like it wasn't. I'm not a physician. I don't know anything about that stuff. But the language in the book was able to be used in a context well outside of pure IT, and a bunch of other places too, banking and telecoms and retail, and actually Sky Betting and Gaming. There's a case study from Sky Betting and Gaming, as was in the Team Topologies book too. So this is very close to home. All right, so this is what we'll talk about. We'll talk about the cost of tangled software. We'll look at how we can use some metrics and Team Topologies principles to help with that. Look at some real examples of detangling software, and then finally, how to detangle, like how to do it. Tangled software is where we've got multiple teams that are all waiting on each other before we can get something out of the door. That's what I mean by that. Which actually, if we're totally honest, is the normal state of software delivery in 2024, sadly, in most organizations. Not every, but most organizations have find themselves in that situation. All right, let's say each engineer in the organization is blocked for 1 hour per day, waiting on one of these other teams that needs to do something so that they can get their change out of the door. 1 hour per day is quite modest. Most organizations, it's probably way more than that. And even if that engineer decides, oh, I'll just start working on something else, now they've increased their work in progress and we've still got the same kind of slowdowns. They've also got a context switch, which again slows them down. So like, we're just taking this as a starting point. How much does it cost this organization if every engineer in the organization is blocked in that kind of tangled way for 1 hour per day? Let's say the fully loaded cost is 160K a year. Maybe that's too low, maybe it's too high, whatever. Let's take that as the figure. 260 paid days a year. We're in Europe with some paid holiday, right? Not in the US where they get nothing. 400 engineers, how much does it cost? Boom, that's at least 8 million a year. At least 8 million a year. And it's probably way more than that because people are probably waiting for more than 1 hour per day. So these companies, 400 people, engineers, almost certainly are paying 16, 24, maybe more million just on having you waiting on you and you're waiting on that person and they're waiting on, just people waiting. They're paying that millions and millions a year, people waiting on other people, like nothing to do with value delivery. And when you look at it through this kind of lens, it looks like madness. So with this, this calculation is way too basic. You want to do more digging and have a bit more evidence if you like, but the money is there to pay for reshaping the architecture of teams, the architecture of software systems for better flow. You can go to the CFO with these kind of figures, a slightly more refined set of figures, but you can go to the CFO and say, hey, look, can we have 4 million to solve an 8 million problem? Yeah, here's 4 million. Like pretty much straight away, if we've done the maths on this stuff, there's money to be unlocked to making our organizations more effective. We're talking kind of about decoupling, untangling, decoupling, something like this. It's sort of the same thing. And we're talking really about separating things that should not be together, that don't need to be together. They might have been together, might have been deployed together or been developed together in the past, but logically these things do not need to be together. Going back to a domain-driven design perspective, they're in separate contexts or subdomains or something like that. They're dealing with different sets of concepts, so they don't need to be together. And so this, it's not just a Team Topologies perspective, but this perspective of trying to achieve fast flow then suggests let's try and decouple things. This is our kind of starting point, our go-to instinct. Let's keep things separate that actually don't need to be together. Some things do need to be together. Train carriages, for example, let's keep them together, because that's not a good thing if they're separate. But there's a lot of things that do not need to be kept together. And we're looking for shorter time to value from decoupling. It's a different kind of value. It's value that emerges over time. So let's get this thing into production. Then this other thing over here is going to get into production a couple of days later. And this thing over here, well, it's not going to get into production until a week later. But you know what? Overall, the total value has got into production way quicker because we've decoupled it. If we try to couple all that stuff together and make it all move towards production at the same time, it would typically take way longer. So that kind of eventually emergent value, I don't know whether that's a thing, but that kind of asynchronous emergent value is like a complete head explosion thing for lots of people to deal with. They think, well, why can't we just package it all up and then deliver it all in one go? So it's a bit of a challenge for quite a few people to get, particularly kind of managers and people with a more enterprisey old school IT background. But we've now got the techniques and the monitoring and the tooling and so on to enable that kind of value flow. So if we do this decoupling, it's enabling multiple independent flows of change, each with its own cadence. So it reaches production at different times, but then when all of the necessary parts are there, then we get the value to the user. We can't always do that. Sometimes we do need to couple things together. And part of the trick in this kind of space, part of the judgment, if you like, or the architectural insight is to work out like how much coupling do we need. From a Team Topologies perspective, though, the kind of coupling that we might look at is related to how many people are involved. What's the size, what's the amount of trust we can have between people? The smaller the group, typically the greater trust. Like a sensible small trust boundary is around 8 people, which is why typically we have a kind of agile team of around 8 people. But you can still get reasonable trust at 15 people. In fact, the case study from Sky Betting and Gaming in the Team Topologies book talks exactly about kind of coupling or pairing 2 teams together, so about 15 people altogether on an ongoing basis, and they worked really well. But that doesn't scale to 150 people. So there'll be techniques that we use where we're happy to kind of bring a few things together in order to kind of get that value out in a slightly more consistent way. But other times, we'd have to have multiple streams arriving into live or production at different times. And there's lots of discipline that's needed to make that work. So it kind of looks, in my head, a bit like this kind of diagram here. Some of these things are big fat, some of them are slower, some of them are smaller, and so on. But it's not all synchronized. And it's fractal as well. So if we dive into another part of the organization inside the blue box, we'll see some similar flows, similar value flows. So these two different threads or strands, if you like. There's decoupling of technology and teams to enable faster value flow, but we need something else too, which is this diffusing of ideas, so that we're bringing in some kind of alignment, even though things are not coupled together as we're delivering them. Decoupling of teams and software and technology and deployments and data and business concepts and all this kind of stuff, great. But then bring in this diffusion of principles and practices and learning and so on to achieve some kind of alignment. A great way to do it is via an agility community of practice like we've got today here, or a meetup group and so on, but taking the time to make that diffusion active. Anyone involved in reliability? I know you are, or used to do. Anyone else involved in like reliability engineering? Okay, maybe I'll skip this part. What's kind of interesting, maybe for your colleagues that are interested in reliability, is decoupling can actually reduce the number of ways that software can fail. So applying this kind of stuff can actually help shift towards more reliable systems too. Specifically, effectively, it's like if we decouple well, it's a bit like having a bomb disposal container like this from the FBI. So if we've got good boundaries for flow, then there's a way of arranging things so that if there's a problem in one service, it doesn't affect very much else. So there's more to say on that, but this could be an interesting way to explore some of these things with your reliability colleagues if you're having those kind of conversations. All right, so what can we do in this space? Like if we've got this challenge of really tangled software, how can we start to untangle it, practically speaking? So we can use these 4 key metrics from the Accelerate book and add what I'm calling block account. This book here, Accelerate, which I think is quite well known. Put your hand up if you've read it. most people, but if you haven't, then it's worth reading. It's published by the same publishers as the Team Topologies book. It's published in 2018. So building and scaling high-performing technology organizations. And some of the things they came out with were what ended up being called 4 key metrics. These are useful baseline kind of metrics for how well software delivery teams and organizations are doing. They're not the only thing we need to look at, but they're kind of a useful kind of starting point. Lead time, like how long it takes to get stuff out of the door. Deployment frequency, how often we're doing that. Mean time to restore, how quickly on average it takes us to bring service back in the live environment. And change fail percentage, like what percentage of times when we're trying to make changes in production does that thing fail. 2 of them encourage fast flow, so lead time and deployment frequency encourage fast flow. And mean time to restore and change fail percentage encourage operability, which is good. It's a nice balance between going quickly and going reliably, effectively. There's another thing we can look at too, which is flow efficiency. What percentage of that lead time is actually real work, actually value-add work? Because sometimes there's a long lead time, but actually it's just waiting on someone else for like the majority of that time. And it turns out that in many organizations, maybe most, the flow efficiency is really low. So in this particular example here, the flow efficiency is only 16%, which means that only 16% of the lead time is spent doing real work. The rest of it is just waiting. So we can like automate as much of this stuff as possible, but if we're only automating that 16% of time where it's actually real work, we still don't really get the time to value down very much at all. It's actually quite difficult to measure the waiting time, it turns out. So what we can do instead is just measure the number of times that people are blocked or a team is blocked on waiting on something else. So just like a counter, effectively. So I'm blocked on this thing. Click a button, press a switch, click something on the screen, whatever it is, I'm blocked, and then we just count the number of blockers. So we're looking at these kind of things, but it's the way in which we're going to use these which is then really interesting, really helpful in terms of decoupling and untangling. We can use these 4 key metrics in the block account to assess and find better team and service boundaries for flow. So we can say, hey, look, if we adjusted the team and service boundaries here, would these 4 key metrics improve? Let's try it, see what happens. When I say adjust the boundaries, let's say a particular calculation happens down here in one part of the system. What would happen if another team had the ability to do that calculation or be responsible for a calculation of that nature in their own software, in their own service? Would that make them more independent? Would that help improve flow? And so on. Same thing with this. If we adjusted the team and service boundaries, would it reduce the block account? And we can experiment with this stuff. So we're using those 4 key metrics and effectively a flow efficiency proxy to help us think about, like, can we adjust the responsibility boundaries across these teams to improve flow? There's also some techniques from the Team Topologies community in this space to help with adjusting team and service boundaries. The first one's called independent service heuristics. It's a bit of a mouthful, but effectively it's we look at the different services or different things that happen inside our organization and say, hey, take that thing. Can we imagine that being run as a cloud service, like a SaaS? So we had in the workshop earlier on, we had an example of, like, there's a postcode lookup API. What's it called? Postcodes.io or something? I think it's that one. And you look up a postcode and it gives you like a geolocation, or you look up a postcode and it gives you the closest city, or you look up a city and it gives you like whatever, it gives you postcode data. Like, it's a kind of viable service. Like, people might pay for that thing. There's all kind of logistics companies might pay for that, and so on and so on. You can imagine building a small but sustainable business around that service. It's a real thing. What else did we have this morning? What was it? There was dog walking as a service, but what are some other ones that were really good? I can't remember now. There's trying on glasses, trying on spectacles as a service, virtually. So you can go to a website, you can pick a pair of spectacles, try it on virtually. It means you don't have to go into the shop, and you can play around with different styles without getting yourself embarrassed, that kind of thing. Like, okay, I get that. And that you can start to see who would pay for that. It's probably the glasses manufacturers or the opticians or what have you, but there's a viable thing around that. And so we use that mental model of a SaaS, like a cloud service, to say, let's look inside the organization and see the different things that are happening. Can we squint at this thing over here and say, can we imagine that running as a cloud service? And if the answer is if the consensus is, yeah, that could possibly run, that's a good indication that that is a candidate for splitting off as a separate service. And there's a really nice collaborative modeling technique. You can see a quick screenshot here where we eventually end up with a heat map from basically opinions and gut feeling from people who are there together in the room at the same time. We might have people from sales and data and security and application and infrastructure and a bunch of other people, product. And they're looking at the different dimensions of this potential candidate separate service and going, actually, this one feels like a really good candidate for kind of splitting off as a separate stream for untangling. But this other one over here, the data's really awkward and all messed up, and it'd be really difficult to pull that out of other things. Let's leave that for now. Because what we're trying to find here is we're trying to detangle kind of opportunistically a little bit. Let's try and detangle the things that we can detangle now. Because if they're all detangled, we can get faster time to value in those things. And then we'll tackle the remainder after that. A bit like chopping up a big thing. Let's chop off the things that we can do first. And that will improve things over time. There's more details at the website here. These slides are going online at 9 o'clock tonight automatically. So you'll find the link there. By the way, all these three techniques I'm showing you now, they're all open. They're Creative Commons, kind of like open source. So there's no license, there's no like paid license to use them. There's a technique called user needs mapping, which is kind of based on Wardley maps, for those of you who are familiar with that. At the top of the diagram, we put the user and their needs, and then we kind of work down and say, hey, to what extent could a single team meet those needs in this context? Where would the responsibility boundary for a single team kind of get too much? Where's it realistic to draw that boundary? It's quite an interesting technique, very user-centric, obviously, and it helps us frame things in a slightly different way. So it gives us a different perspective on where team boundaries can be, how we can detangle things compared to ISH, the previous one. And there's also team interaction modeling as a technique, which uses the very flow-centric Team Topologies diagram style like you can see on here, again, to help us think how could we reshape these boundaries over time, which kind of helps planning for kind of architecture shifts and responsibility shifts, and it helps with things like planning for hiring new skills and all kind of things like that. And again, like the other two, this technique is open. And we've been using these techniques week in, week out for the last 5 years, for the last 4.5 years. And so they're quite refined now, they're quite usable. There's lots of examples of people using these kind of things, and they're very collaborative. The idea is to then bring together multiple perspectives, like Tom said at the beginning, we've got kind of collective intelligence, bring together this collective intelligence and give us these different perspectives so that we've got a rapid way of gaining confidence about trying something. These techniques don't give you hard and fast guarantees or data or anything like that, but it's a way to get to a level of confidence and agreement with the people involved on a like consensus on a way forward very rapidly. Let's have a look at some examples of detangling for fast flow now. And the first one is from JP Morgan, financial services powerhouse. And there's a great talk online from Fast Flow Conference 2023 in May last year, which is entitled How JP Morgan Applied Team Topologies to Improve Flow in a Market-Leading Enterprise Platform. You can watch it, don't watch it now, because it'll be a bit distracting if we can hear the sound on your mobile. We can go and watch it later. Here's a screenshot from that video. On the left-hand side, you can see like the hated red safe string everywhere, showing all the dependencies. But they mapped out all the delivery dependencies beforehand. Then they applied kind of Team Topologies thinking and practices to decouple things for fast flow. And the result is on the right-hand side, where you can see there's very little red string. I mean, you can't see the details, but that's not the point. The point is on the right-hand side, there's way fewer dependencies. Now, we don't know exactly how much this saved, but they did achieve 60% of dependencies reduced through better team design based on Team Topologies ideas, flow-based ideas, and Team Topologies specifically. Now, how much money did they save or unlock? Don't know, but like it's probably in the millions, based on how tangled it was before. So organizations are already doing this, and JP Morgan doesn't make Mickey Mouse software, right? They make some fairly, well-respected, well-used finance trading platforms and so on and so on. This is like kind of fairly serious software, if you like. You're not selling pizzas online or whatever. So it's being used in context where there's high stakes, I guess, and high expectations. There's another example online from a company called Wealth Wizards. They provide financial advice for consumers and companies, early adopter explainable AI, a bunch of other things. They had interesting growth up to about 2019 for a few years. And then things kind of came to a halt. They got to a point where they couldn't really make very many changes. The architecture was too coupled. There were too many dependencies and so on. Thankfully, like a couple of months later, the Team Topologies book came out. So they're like, woo, this looks like there could be some useful ideas and principles in here. We ran a session with them early on using like an early version of independent service heuristics, and that helped them to unlock some thinking for them about how they can re-architect. And this is a diagram from 2020 which shows some of the Team Topologies style colors and diagram shapes and things. It gave them some insight into how they can decouple. In particular, because we use independent service heuristics, which is talking about like looking for independent services that could be run as a SaaS, like a cloud product. One of their competitors literally was offering one of their capabilities as a service in the cloud. So they're like, well, if our competitor is offering that thing in the cloud, then we can have that as an independent service internally, at the very least. So it literally mapped onto how they could decouple their architecture by using independent service heuristics to give them that clue. So then Richard Marshall, who was the CTO at Wealth Wizards until a few years ago, is saying, Team Topologies has given us the tools we're looking for and it helped us to build a plan and have confidence that we know where we're going and how to get there. And part of this was to think of things in terms of boundaries that help flow. That was like a key insight. There are lots of different ways of doing boundaries, but if we're focused on boundaries that help flow, it unlocks some really useful kind of architectural and procedural and like personnel decisions, which otherwise would be blocking flow. And my company, Team Topologies, helps organizations do exactly this, organize for fast flow value. So if you're looking for some help in that space, get in touch and we can help you. All right, let's look at how to do this, how to detangle. We can track dependencies and separate as blocking versus non-blocking. We talked about that before. A dependency that I don't have to think about it, it's just there and it allows me to do other things. A non-blocking dependency is brilliant, great. But anything where I've got to wait on something else for a decision before I can move forward, something we need to kind of turn that blocking dependency into something that is more like non-blocking. And so in the diagram, that's what this looks like. We've got a blocking dependency here. We're having to wait. How can we avoid that wait? There's lots of different ways, but if we're particularly building software systems, can we provide it as a service from what we'd call a platform? And then it becomes non-blocking because we can just consume it if we've got the right credentials and so on. There's some nice tools online. One tool that's helpful in this space is called Code Scene, and it helps to detect hidden coupling. Helps to do loads of things actually, but helps to detect hidden coupling. And for example, it helps to measure how well your organization aligns with your architecture. So for those of you who know about Conway's Law, that's what this is trying to do. Code Scene is a tool which it looks at code, particularly Git repositories, but then maps that through to the social aspects of coding. So it can identify team boundaries just by looking at the Git commit history, which is kind of magic, but then it's doing some kind of making some assumptions and things. It's just, yeah, that's amazing. It can do things like predict, it can look at risk. If you know that there's some people leaving the company, they're handed in their resignation, or you know there's a load of redundancies or what have you that need to happen, you can actually map out the risks of those people leaving by saying, well, who would be left to be able to support the software that's left behind? So it's like looking at the socio-technical aspects of software via CodeScene. It's an amazing tool. I wish I'd written it. The guy who wrote it, called Adam Thornhill, is just amazing. He's written some books in this space. My other company, Conflict, is actually starting to partner with these people because I've been an admirer of this tool for a very long time. I love the focus on the kind of the social aspect of coding, and that's what they've effectively encoded in the tool. It's super to see in action. We've got a little hint about how to look at some team dependencies tracking on GitHub, on the Team Topologies page here. It's inspired from details by Spotify, but it's basically just a spreadsheet, but it can get the conversation going about thinking about tracking dependencies. Interesting example here. I did some work at the UK Government Home Office. Where's Eve? Hey, hi. This is back in 2018. There's a blog post online that describes how the Home Office's Immigration Technology Department reduced its cloud costs by 40%. So I wasn't involved in this project directly, but I sat literally next to the people who were involved in this, so I could kind of hear what's going on all the time and see what they were doing. It's a public blog post, you can read it, it's all great. And they come up with some kind of these EPC type cost efficiency charts, which is kind of cool. It's saying, hey, your cloud costs are currently like this. If you did this other thing, you could reduce your cloud cost. It's really good. It's all good stuff. The interesting thing in terms of decoupling is this. Because there was this focus on cloud costs, the service owners for a particular area were now accountable for the spend. And they started getting very interested in what was inside their service versus what was outside their service. And so suddenly, because we were tagging things with AWS tags and similar things in logging and a bunch of these things, then we could say, well, actually, this entire service end-to-end, including the data and so on, is cost this much. And so they were like, well, I don't think this responsibility should be included in our service. Let's shift where that responsibility sits. So it's very interesting to see this happening. The cost metrics are effectively like a financial knife, like a scalpel to split things apart. You could take this too far. This could go too far. You've got to be careful with it. But it was really interesting to see this actually appear. Things started to get split apart, which enabled better flow. And that was driven from a financial perspective. It's a little bit like FinOps, effectively, but maybe almost in reverse. It's kind of cool to see it. However, we've done all this decoupling for fast flow. Great. But if we've got all these clear boundaries for flow with limited interactions, how do we actually create alignment? What stops teams going off and doing a whole load of 75 different ways of working with ChatGPT or some other OpenAI interface or whatever? Like, what stops teams from pulling in very different directions in terms of, I don't know, culture and metrics or observability or UX or product management? How are we actually going to learn from each other? Because if we've got these good boundaries in place, almost certainly we don't have teams working across multiple different parts of the software estate. Almost certainly not. We wouldn't want to. The domain context needed is way too high. There's a danger that we've got people dipping into other code bases and not really understanding it properly, making a quick change over here, and then someone else gets called at 2 in the morning. And they go, what is this? Who made this change over here? Why am I getting called up for someone's random code change over this side of the organization? So we kind of want these clear boundaries in place to enable flow. But there's a danger that we then have lots of very small kind of separate ways of doing things, which are not aligned. Remember this diagram here, we've got multiple independent flows that are fractally and it happens fractally. We need something like this. We need this kind of thing happening, this kind of diffusion of awareness and practices created by things like communities of practice, like we're here today, but other techniques too. Actively diffusing this. We can't just accidentally make this stuff happen, partly because it's hybrid working now, so we're not going to bump into people, but also because just like with Flutter, you've got operations in multiple different countries, different time zones. You're not going to bump into people. Like, as a starting point, you're almost certainly not going to find those people on a day-to-day basis. We have to make it a much more active thing, much more planned and funded, properly funded. From the State of DevOps Report 2019, High-performing organizations favor strategies that create community structures at both low and high levels in the organization. This should be an active choice that we're funding properly inside organizations to enable us to go quickly. What's that now? That's 5 years ago. That was a finding from the State of DevOps report. And there's been plenty of evidence of community structures helping to drive good outcomes for way longer than way before 2019. We're talking about things like internal conferences, public blogs, guilds, lunch and learn communities of practice, these kind of things being actively championed and nurtured and shepherded, if you like, to achieve this kind of alignment and engagement across the organization, to allow us to go quickly. I actually wrote a book about internal conferences. This is before Team Topologies book, so this is with Victoria Morgan Smith. This was published in early 2019, so if you're interested, here's a manual for running an internal conference, and get in touch, we can kind of help. Here's what the CEO of the organization that I was working for at the time said. This initiative around internal conferences has been the single most effective thing to align business and technology that I have seen in this organization. Now, if the CEO is involved and is happy to say something like that, this is kind of important from an organizational perspective. There's going to be money that's unlocked to make this stuff happen, but we have to do it in the right way. Any initiative in this space should include activity that explicitly aligns business and technology, that explains what we're doing in technology and why, and explains that to people outside of technology, so that we can get buy-in and alignment. We're not fighting against each other, if you like. We're not accidentally fighting against each other. It turns out it's quite awkward, it's quite complicated to do this stuff. And so my company, Conflux, has been doing this with some of our customers over the last few years, including TELUS Digital, which is a telecoms company in Canada. And we did some work there for 2 years, 2020 to 2022. And Steve Tannock, the director, one of the directors there, is saying the way the Conflux crew used their active knowledge diffusion approach to seek out and champion good practices was a real revelation to us at TELUS and helped to shift thinking around how we innovate and share success. So it has a very practical use, but they weren't doing it beforehand. They hadn't kind of prioritized it as a thing. They hadn't funded it. We got in there and said, wow, this really needs to happen. Okay, you Conflux people can do it. And it produce useful results. But what we also see often is there's often this focus on fast flow, on decoupling, on teams, on architecture, and so on and so on. But this stuff gets forgotten. Not in Flutter, I'm happy to see, that's very good. But in many organizations, it does get forgotten or sidelined, or it's just kind of side of desk. It's someone's little hobby project which doesn't get the money to make it really, really work. If you want to go quickly, we need to have this active diffusion of knowledge and awareness for alignment and engagement and trust inside the organization. So we've pulled together this into an actual, like a packaged approach called Adapt Together. It's to create alignment and trust and engagement across the organization in the context of delivering at pace with fast flow. Because if we were going slowly, we wouldn't need to do this stuff. We could just meet together, we can take all our time in the world. If we're actually having to deliver on a rapid cadence, on a regular basis, sustainably, we need this stuff actively in place. So again, if you're in a place where you need some of this stuff, come and have a word, and we'll help you with that. You too can save millions of pounds a year by decoupling for fast flow. Put that in your brain, that's fine. This is the kind of story that we can hook this activity on if we go to the CFO. There's techniques to use. We could use some health metrics, some techniques from the Team Topologies community, and so on to help with this kind of decoupling. But it's not just about the decoupling part. Yes, we need to do that. That's how we get a fast flow of value. But then we need to diffuse the learning and knowledge for trust and engagement and alignment. So there we go. Thank you. I'm looking forward to some discussion, questions, that kind of thing. Any questions? Objections? Eve, I think I saw first. So how does it work in a situation where we're not all moving towards the same goal? So a lot of the stuff I talked about, certainly in terms of the active knowledge diffusion, came out of the work I was doing at UK government back then, because we had multiple different things going on. There was some of it was around passports, some was around Brexit, some was around citizenship and a bunch of other things. Lots of different kind of programs of work, but there's still need for alignment across practices, ways of working, terminology, that kind of thing. So I think it's needed in general in organizations. I mean, as organizations are doing more and more different things, it's more and more needed ultimately. Does that answer the question? Like it doesn't need just a singular focus in the organization to make this stuff important anyway. Like we can still learn from each other, even if we're focused on very different kind of services or products. Like how do we do, what does continuous delivery mean to us? What are some good practices for logging? We did something cool over here. Can we share that with other people? Because these people over here hate their logging experience. The second line support people absolutely hate it. Well, these people love it now. Can we share what we did with these other people so that we can improve their lives as well? So it can work in a heterogeneous kind of product environment, very much so, because it's about the practices and the ways of working and the mindset and that kind of thing too. I can't remember. Let's go through them and come to you.
Do you have any tips for dealing with the kind of territorial politics you can get from changing responsibilities?
Not really. But of course, behind those territorial politics is some incentives. Incentives around, I don't know how much people get rewarded or paid, or their sense of seniority because they've got 500 people rather than just 200 under them, and all this kind of stuff. So some of it is definitely about looking at the incentives at leadership level, which is hard. Right? But so I don't have anything magic in there around that. Yeah. Has anyone else got any magic tips around dealing with politics in large organizations? No. But moving towards like looking at the underlying incentives, and it's executive level behavior which then needs to change, which is then even harder. But that's where it needs to come from. It can happen.
So a lot of the examples are of internal systems being decoupled and detangled, and value streams internally being identified to be decoupled. But have you seen any organisations that have used any AI products to decouple their systems for them? So to extract data from various
areas, that's a good question. So there are some products coming out now that do exactly this. So there's a tool called TeamOS. If you go to teamos.is for Iceland, TeamOS, and that's explicitly focused on decoupling for fast flow. So it'll look at metadata in Slack. It'll do sentiment analysis on messages in Slack and Jira and a bunch of places like this, and go, it looks like these two teams are expecting to, looks like this one team here is expecting just to consume a service from another team. Like it should be fairly friction free. There shouldn't be very much communication going backwards and forwards if you've got a good API. But it turns out there's loads and loads of messages all the time. That's a signal it's a signal to have a look at it, at the very least. And then there's other tools in this space, like the code scene one I mentioned is kind of cool, but that's more look at the code level. There's another tool called Robusta. I've got a webinar coming up on the 1st of October with the founder of Robusta. They do they call it like a virtual SRE, so like a virtual operations engineer who's looking at using AI to suggest incident remediation for engineers who are on call and stuff like this. So it's actually quite interesting what's coming out in this space now to using signals and aggregating that data and doing whatever AI is, whether it's machine learning or whether it's LLM stuff, to provide some prompts for humans to be able to have better conversations about, say, reshaping boundaries and what have you. So we're definitely starting to see that stuff come out now. We'll do lots of conversations afterwards. I think you were actually next. How do you know when to prioritize working on this versus everything else going on? I suppose it depends on things like time to value and flow and stuff like that, but also, we've not talked today much about it, but team cognitive load, which is one key concept in the Team Topologies book. Like, if we're going to have a sustainable fast flow value, then we need to be looking at these things all the time, really. Like every week, we need to have those kind of metrics are first class, really. Like team cognitive load and code-based health, time to lead time and things like that are metrics which really tell us how healthy our delivery approach is. If we're going to ignore them, we do that at our peril, because ultimately that then it leads to elevated risk and everything else that goes downhill from there. So, I don't know, it has to be a balanced approach, but these are things which teams should be looking at every week in terms of their own metrics, but also then groups of teams need to be looking at as an aggregate on at least a weekly basis. I didn't properly answer your question. I'm aware of that because it's hard, right? But great. Thanks for the questions, everyone.